afternoon and welcome to the Midwest House. You are all here, if you don't know, if you might be in the wrong place, you're here to talk about equity and accessibility in transportation. Does that seem like, yeah, that's what everyone's here for? Great. Yes, equity. So before we get started, I kind of just want to give a little bit of an overview on why we're all here and kind of the perspective that we're all coming from. So everyone that you see on the stage here today is from the great Mitten State of Michigan and are representing, yes, there's so much excitement in this crowd today. It makes my life much easier. So if you are not familiar with Michigan, Michigan has a population of just under 10 million people, which makes it the 10th largest state in the United States. It's home to an incredibly diverse group of citizens, both ethnically and culturally. It is home to 26 automakers, 96 out of the top 100 automotive suppliers, 2,200 facilities that specialize in automotive and mobility design, testing, engineering, validation, and it has 68% of the country's R&D is spent in the state of Michigan. So there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening within the state. So from projects and universities, pilot programs, the companies that call the state home, it is truly one of the most densest cluster of automotive and transportation. Ooh, there is construction. The densest cluster of automotive and transportation innovation that's happening than anywhere else in the world. And so everyone that's on the stage today has a little piece to play or big piece to play in that puzzle. So I'm going to sort of turn it over, give some introductions to everyone, or allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. Paul, yep, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Kretko. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called Arbor Spark. We're a public-private partnership, academic partnership, centered around the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. For those of you who don't know, to support the depth of the ecosystem, if you will, University of Michigan has the largest publicly funded research budget in the United States, $1.5 billion. Our job at Spark is that we work with early stage companies that come out of that milieu at the university. We have about 250 companies in our portfolio now, and we start about 40 new startups a year, a lot of them in the mobility space. So I'll stop there.
And I'm Erin McCurry. I am the product manager for accessibility at May Mobility, which is a shared autonomous transportation company based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We actually spun out of a robotics lab, but we're actually on the roads operating today. So we've given over 300,000 autonomous rides across the US. We also have an active site in Japan. But the way that we approach autonomous transportation is through partnering with cities and research institutes and other public partners to ensure that we're developing autonomous technology in an equitable and accessible way.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. My name is Kristen Shaw. I'm a senior communications consultant at WSP, which is a global civil engineering firm. I've also recently co-authored a book, Women Driven Mobility, with our facilitator, Caitlin, which kind of focuses around the story of what happens when you have more diverse perspectives at the decision-making table. And during the day, I kind of focus on mostly Michigan, Ohio, and Midwest projects that are transportation and infrastructure focused. I've also been able to work nationally on some larger projects that are at the federal level, kind of working through how we can connect the communities to different engineers and different designers, planners, kind of throughout the entire planning process to make sure that those voices are heard and considered when the decisions about their communities are being made. And so I serve on a team of about 80 people all over the US. We have a pretty large footprint here in Austin, so it's been exciting to kind of chat with them while I've been here. But that's kind of what we do. We are the glue between the engineers and the communities. And so, Hind?
Hi everyone, my name is Hind Orahu, and I am a mobility policy principal at VIA Transportation. So VIA operates within the transit tech sector, and what we do is help optimize transit tech systems. So we help agencies, transit agencies and DOTs be able to operate and scale and potentially also introduce on-demand transit to their transit systems. So yeah, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you all. And then I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. My name is Caitlin Davis. I am the communications lead at Cavenue, which is a road developer that is developing the roadway of the future. We're working with DOTs to enable roads for autonomous vehicles of the future. And then also a co-author with Kristen on the Women-Driven Mobility book. So to kind of get things kicked off with all of you, I want to just sort of set the stage with the audience on equity and access and talk about some of those forgotten populations. So my question for all of you, and Paul, if you want to start, is just to kind of talk about some of the audiences that you've worked with in the past that have either unique mobility needs or have often been forgotten by some of the more traditional means of transportation.
Yeah, I think the main area that we've tried to work in is with populations that are disadvantaged in terms of their income. Particularly in the geography that we work in, there's a tale of two Ann Arbors, if I can put it that way. West of a certain freeway, there are folks that have privilege and advantage in transportation. East of that roadway, going more towards Detroit, are many people who've been dislocated by sort of the change in manufacturing and a loss of jobs. And how do they connect back to the economy? So the populations that we're focusing on with a lot of the initiatives we have is how to be able to get those folks the transportation services they need that many times they are without cars of their own. I mean, so that's how do you get those folks to participate in the economy and reach them?
Yeah, and so I work with people with disabilities a lot, and kind of flipping your question upside down, traditional public transit works pretty well for people with disabilities for the most part. What we're trying to do, though, is make sure that future transportation solutions are including people with disabilities in the development and deployment process. So, there's a lot of AV companies who are building their own AVs from the ground up. Billions of dollars have been spent, many years have been spent doing this, and a lot of them don't even have a wheelchair ramp. So we're just trying to make sure that these steps that we're taking in technology are bringing everyone along, and getting feedback directly from those riders to develop those systems.
So mine is a little less focused on most days. Since I work on a lot of federal programs, we're working with like the FHWA and FTA to kind of think about what is the baseline across the U.S., which is a huge kind of mess of different transportation systems on all different levels. And so we are challenged often with, okay, you have to talk to everybody and get a representative opinion and perspective of how all of these different people are using it. And so generally we'll kind of throw something out that is hopefully going to reach everybody, and then eventually kind of do some more targeted outreach. We have a large focus on ADA populations, on tribal governments and those members, specifically folks without broadband access, and so there's a little bit more investment in planning in those efforts. Anybody that kind of is quiet in the conversation, we do a little extra planning and investment in, and I think the measurement of that is probably one of the more interesting parts, is kind of how do we go through all of these discussions and make sure that the communities are represented in an equitable way. So it depends on the geography. Michigan, very large on seniors, on the tribal governments, and then also the ADA community.
That's a really good question, and that's a question that so in a previous life, I was also working for the city of Detroit, and we really had to pinpoint exactly who are we talking about equity groups. And when we did a general assessment of what's all the data that is out there that is helping us understand who are we serving with our mobility options that we have out there, whether it is public transit or not, we realized that there is 5 groups that are really hurting when it comes to transportation. And the first is youth under 18. How are they getting to school? How are they getting to entertainment? How are they getting around their city? That's data that we don't necessarily have. And also we know that we're not providing them with many options. The second group is mothers who are coming from carless households. So, putting this into context, Detroit up until recently had 4 times the national average in terms of insurance rates. And so to not own a car in Detroit is not something that is unheard of. And so these households specifically, when there are mothers in these households, how are they going about their day? How are they doing childcare? How are they getting to work after dropping their kid at childcare or at school? So youth under 18, mothers coming from carless households, low-income households in general, older adults who are over 65, and lastly, people living with disabilities. And so these are the 5 groups that I personally think are my target, whether it is at my work back in the city of Detroit or right now my work at VIA.
Perfect, thank you. And so you guys talked about these audiences, and I know quite a bit about the work that you guys have been doing, and I know that the community engagement piece of it is such a big part of the process. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about, one, how do you identify the audiences? Hind, you sort of talked about going in and looking at some of that data, but how do you really figure out who's been left out? And then how do you use engagement to fix that problem? So Hind, I'll start with you. So based on your work with the city of Detroit, you did a lot of pilot projects. What did that engagement process look like with those 5 groups that you just talked about?
There's always a before COVID and after COVID conversation, and so I'll just talk about after COVID engagement because that was really the heartache, because we did not know how to engage audiences, and what we ended up doing is literally just picking up the phone and calling people, and these phone calls would last between 10 minutes to 45 minutes, where we're just calling in, understanding how people are making those decisions to choose transportation options. How are they getting around? How are they getting to medical appointments, etc.? And so, honestly, it just gets down to those basics. A lot of our reps in the neighborhoods also had to learn how to use Zoom, and so we would plug into community hall, what is it called? Community engagement events through Zoom. But I know also at VIA, we also had faced the same issue. Like, how do you now engage people when you can't have in-person engagement through block clubs, et cetera? And this also differs between residents and also community organizations. So the engagement there differs in a way. But yeah, I mean, the question still pertains. If you're talking about children and how they're going to school, how are you engaging children? And how are you asking them how is their ride to get to school? So yeah, I'll stop there.
Perfect. And then Aaron, same sort of question for you, but you guys have been working at May Mobility on ADA shuttles, autonomous shuttles. Can you talk a little bit about the process you guys went through? I know you talked a lot in the community, and that was a big part of your process.
Yeah. And this story is actually told probably more comprehensively in Caitlin and Kristen's books. So, if you want more information, definitely check that out.
It is a whole chapter in the book.
Yeah. But yeah, so the way that we approach creating an autonomous vehicle route in a city is not by just drawing a line on a map and saying, this is where we're going to go. It's really important that our service is actually bringing transportation to people who need it. And the best way to identify where they need transportation is to meet directly with them. So we work with cities to create a route, and we try to bring that same mindset to creating our ADA-compliant vehicles. So working directly with people with disabilities, with disability advocacy groups to understand their needs beyond what the regulation says, and also thinking about, what gaps will exist when we take drivers out of the vehicle. Today, there's still a lot of parts of the puzzle that are not solved. How does someone in a wheelchair independently secure themselves? How do we design user experiences inside the vehicle that are usable for people with cognitive disabilities? things like that. So the best way that we've done that is by working with cities to be connected to the people with disabilities that they work with directly, those people who are already active in community engagement, and really learning from them and giving them a seat at the table because the end user knows best. We learn a lot from our riders through that. So.
Awesome, thank you. Kristen, this one's for you. So I want to talk a little bit about the Michigan Long Range Plan. And for those of you who don't know of the Michigan Long Range Plan, it is a 25-year plan around re-envisioning Michigan's transportation systems. Kristen worked on that project a lot, and it spans the entire state of Michigan from Southeast Michigan, where Detroit is, all the way up to the Upper Peninsula, which most people think is part of Wisconsin or Canada anyways, but it is not, it is part of Michigan. And so, Kristen, can you talk a little bit about the community engagement process that you had with that plan and how you used it to ensure equity in the plan?
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't planners, the long-range planning process is something that is required by different states, by the federal government. And so this wasn't really revolutionary, just kind of by doing the project. But when we came together and said, how can we do this a little bit differently, the team at the Michigan Department of Transportation said, okay, like what hasn't been included in the past? And so it just kind of started to become this very comprehensive approach to long-range planning. Again, nothing revolutionary other than including freight and rail. That seemed to be the thing that was missing. And I think as most of us learned through, I think we're all experts on supply chain now, understanding how important the freight and rail transportation systems are to our economy, to our lives, everything. And so it was kind of pairing this pedestrian experience with the experience of a locomotive, which are very, very different, and then everything in between. And so it was done in a phased approach. It was done throughout the entire state of Michigan. And right at the beginning of phase 2, I think we kicked off in March of 2020, maybe a couple weeks prior, and the entire project was scoped to be in person. And so we had planned to go out to these different communities to have these conversations to make sure that everybody was getting a chance to have a face-to-face interaction and talk about their transportation experience. And so that could kind of form what we were going to do over the next 20 years. That was put on pause immediately. And it's really, I think one of the more interesting things about that engagement process is that the gaps in the conversation, the equity pieces that were missing were always there. They just weren't always so visible. And so once we started to go online and we conducted probably over 100 workshops with active transportation, we talked to the freight and rail folks, which was a big learning experience for me. Talked to people who like their cars, love their cars. I mean, Michigan is, Motor City, and people don't, they don't want to steer away from that. And then there's the other side of that where there's the transit folks who say, we need to do better with transit here in Michigan. And so kind of talking to all of those people, creating a new kind of baseline for the entire state and then putting it into one project. At the same time, there's plenty of rural communities in the state of Michigan. There's tribal governments that have their own transportation planning processes. And so we had to kind of have all of these conversations in a virtual way. And so throughout that entire process, we learned a lot. And then, you take it all together and you hope you get everybody. But through surveys, through a lot of the tools that are available online, even Zoom, just as a very basic one, but understanding the value of having somebody like a sign language interpreter on those Zoom calls makes all the difference. The project was able to reach every single county in the state of Michigan, which was a really big accomplishment for us. We talked to about 6,300 people to understand what their experiences were and kind of put that together and hope that it sticks for the next 20 years. We will go through again in the next 5 years and redo the process, but when you're tasked with talking to everybody and understanding what the state's opinion is, it certainly is troubling. And then I think on top of that, we're talking to people who they have public health concerns. They can't go to the grocery store. Somebody in their family is sick. Maybe they're a doctor or first responder. And so you're trying to take this thing that is very important to us and important to you. And we talk about transportation and it's our day-to-day. But most folks just kind of, use the roads or use their transportation methods and don't kind of worry about the other stuff that's for us. And so you're trying to make it really important when there was a lot more important stuff happening. And it was a really, I think, exciting time to be a part of the project. But I think the biggest challenge was the internet, understanding how much of Michigan doesn't have the broadband capacity. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of I feel like I could talk about this forever. It was awesome, but crazy at the same time.
I think everything that you guys just said, the biggest part of all of that is that none of this happens in a silo, and there's so many players that come into every different aspect of it. And so, Paul, I want to talk a little bit about the public-private partnerships that are happening in this space, because you're working with multiple people on this stage today. And so can you give a little bit of insight into why these public-private partnerships are so valuable, not only for the region from an economic development standpoint, but for the communities and for the companies themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to understand about successful public-private partnerships is, can you create a platform that's long-lasting, that brings different elements together to solve specific problems? So we've been around for about 17 years. That's a long-lived public-private partnership. Some of these start and they end. And one of the things that I try to tell other communities that's really, really important is creating the platform and having the relationships before you want to take off on a new project is really important. Because if you have to create the platform to work together every time a new initiative comes up, you're wasting a lot of energy. So what we do is, I use the word curation. We see our role as knowing what's going on in the ecosystem, in the region, and connecting various pieces of it. We don't have to own it. Sometimes we do. For example, the project that we're working on with May, we felt that downtown Ann Arbor could be a living laboratory for projects. I've been involved with the connected vehicle space since about 2012. If you all go back in time with me, there was a lot of hype. By today, we weren't going to be in cars. We were going to be all driving around in these vehicles, and they were going to take us everywhere we go. If you talk to the engineers, they tell you, really complicated. We developed a facility in Ann Arbor, adjacent to Ann Arbor, which is called American Center for Mobility, which is a connected vehicle testing environment, off-road. We were told by the Obama administration, we don't need anything like this because we're going to figure this all out in simulation. It's all going to be solved. The companies tell us now, we have a hard time making these things work on a sunny day in Phoenix. So where I'm getting at is having a platform where you can, with early stage companies, with mature companies who want to try things out, creating a real world environment where they can do that is really, really important. So what's our role? Well, we talk to Ann Arbor, a city, and say, hey, we like to use the roads, and we have credibility with them, and they say, okay, we trust you. And then May Mobility comes along and says, well, we want to use that environment. And then what we then did with them is we had another startup who has a technology that you all could put in your cell phone, that when you're walking down the street, that connected car would know you were there. And we asked May, can we get you two to work together to test that technology out? Now, why is that important? Well, if you're going down the street and somebody's walking on a corner, the car can't see you past that building. So it's an important piece for adoption and for safety. So that's why these partnerships are really important, because you create the environment for technology to be tested, validated, and shown to the marketplace, shown to people in the community that it's okay. There was a statistic a while back that 65% of people in this country don't think they ever want to get near a connected and autonomous vehicle. Well, if we can show them in the street and how it's working, then that adoption is going to go up, particularly for disadvantaged populations who don't have access to transportation.
That was going to be my follow-up question, is what projects have you been working on that center around accessibility, equity, and helping the community that way?
Yeah, some are successful and go forward. We're now in the midst of a full year with May Mobility with, is it 4 or 5? I forget. 4? It's 4. So we have 3 vehicles that are just regular Toyota.
Lexus RX 450.
One of them is configured for disabled individuals to use, and you can now call that vehicle up on your phone in Ann Arbor. It'll come to your location, pick you up, take you to the place you want to go on the route. And so that's an example of one that we're trying. Prior to that, Ford came to us and said, and they're still working on it, they thought they could create the operating system for cities in transportation. And they wanted an environment. They tried to do it in Columbus. It was too big. Ann Arbor is a compact city with city kind of features, and it was a more demonstratable environment for them to work on. We're actively involved in the project that she's involved in, which is very interesting because the idea is to connect, to create a connected autonomous vehicle corridor between downtown Detroit and Ann Arbor. Those of you familiar with that geography, it's going to go through lots of different environments with different populations that aren't being served. So we're going to be able to test use cases in different environments, different street configurations, different kinds of urban structures that are going to be really informative to what we really can deliver to the community.
Thanks for giving Cavenu a shout out. I love that.
It's a great project.
If I can just piggyback of
Yeah.
what Paul just said, I think that it is, wherever you sit in the ecosystem, in the mobility ecosystem, it is really hard to do anything or get anything to a successful place by yourself. And I think that it's also really hard when you don't consider your users or residents or however you want to call that population. When you don't consider them stakeholders, when you don't consider that part of the partnership is also with them. And I think that that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned working for government, that we can't do it by ourselves. We need the private sector. We need researchers. We need basically community organizations. We need voices from individuals to be able to get to whatever we need to be. And I think that the biggest, what I find to be really my job is not necessarily designing solutions for or imagining what the future in this place is going to look like in terms of transportation, but really convening the right players who can actually answer to what people need. And so, and I think that was definitely a mindset switch for me to switch my role from, okay, like I design solutions for Detroit residents or for people who don't have transit, communities that are left behind. I don't design solutions for them where I don't bring them to their streets and neighborhoods, but I actually convene the right players for them to voice what they need out of their environment. And I think that was definitely it made a huge difference in outcomes and also in shortening timelines for pilots.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about this grouping of people on the stage today is because even though when we originally put together this panel, we didn't put it together with the plan of everyone's kind of working with each other, but the more that we were prepping and talking, we really realized that there's a lot of overlap in the projects. And when I talked earlier about the number of companies and all of the pilots and programs that are happening in the state of Michigan, there are competitors that are collaborating with each other, that are working with government, that are working with some of the other engineering firms like Kristen, and all coming together to really develop projects that serve people in an authentic way, in a way that's going to help make everyone's lives a little bit better. And help them get to where they need to go, whether it's to the doctor or to school or to work, whatever it is. And so it's a really interesting model when you start to kind of step back and look at everyone that's working together. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the last 2 years. So this week, as we all know, we entered our third year of the pandemic, and although things feel really great right now, and it seems like we're getting to start this new chapter, I want to sort of reflect on where we've been the last 2 years and what we've learned. So my next question is for all of you, but really, how did the pandemic change how you look at mobility, especially when we talk about access and equity? What really became apparent in those first couple months?
People's behaviors and patterns have changed. Not only that, but we now have plenty of mobility and transportation options that have been tested in the past 2 years. And so, like, where do electric bikes that are shared fall into the conversation? Where do scooters fall into the conversation? Where does microtransit and on-demand shuttles fall into the conversation? So there's like plenty more options. There are not just the fixed routes or the subway or the tramway. Not only that, but we're also operating under a different political climate and a different funding structure that's going to come up. So with the infrastructure bill and how it's going to impact transportation infrastructure and update it, I think that so this is where I stand today, right? But all of this has been developing in the past 2 years thanks to all of the players in the ecosystem. And what I have been most concerned with in the past 2 years is really essential workers. Because, I mean, if I said essential workers at the beginning of 2020, no one would have understood who I was talking about. But now we understand very well how they are so core to our public transit ridership, right? And so that's what I've been focusing on. How do we serve them? How do we serve that population? Also, as a new mother, I have been really plugged into how children get to school and like what are all the struggles that parents go to. And so there's a new vertical at VIA to be able to provide transportation in New York for school children through school buses, right? And the joke is that if you order pizza, you know exactly when it's getting prepared, when it gets into the oven, when it leaves the shop, how long it's going to take to get to you, right? But then that's not the same when you put your kid out there to get into a school bus and make sure that they get to school on time. And so I think that there has been a hyper focus in the past 2 years on populations that we have been overlooking for a long time, and I think that that's really paving the way, at least for me, for how I see transportation in the future. I don't know if I answered your question, but
No,
yeah.
you did. Kristen, do you want to talk about just sort of what you've learned in the pandemic and how that sort of changed how you look at mobility access?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of three things that come to mind for me. One is just the ability to listen as a part of the engineering process, which has not always really been front and center. And then after you listen, having empathy in those conversations, in those plans, in those designs, and then also kind of thinking about the two different priorities that are happening. And so when you look at the state and you look at these really innovative private companies and that are trying to move things forward, the past 2 years have just kept going. And at the same time, all of the people, all of these road users have had to deal with all of the things that we have, and just life has changed drastically. And so we're kind of having these competing interests of saying we're trying to move to the future, but everybody can't get past the end of the day or the end of the week. And so you're trying to have these very big, very future-looking conversations with people who are just trying to get to tomorrow. And I think one of the things that I'm really I'm excited about is that we all know that communities and populations are left out, are intentionally excluded from conversations, intentionally excluded from planning and design processes, and we all have been fighting for them. And the pandemic, in a silver lining kind of way, got in front of the people who said, oh, wait, we should invest here. We should talk to these people. And we're all kind of like, yes, we should. Thank you. And so it's really opened the door that investment is now just in the process. You don't kind of have to make the case for it like you did, because we've all seen exactly what the results are when you forget people. And so I think that, and I hope that will continue as we kind of exit this, but the folks who were not talking about equity and accessibility and making sure the exact number of people that need to come to the presentation and contribute are now really focused on the numbers and making sure that we're not just checking a box, we're checking a box and it's meaningful, which is something that certainly when I entered the consulting world, I was scared of, that this might not be how it goes. But it's really been nice because you get a little bit of the behind the curtain of what those thoughts are in all these different types of projects. And so just seeing empathy being attached to engineering projects has been very rewarding. And then I think just things that we weren't measuring by. So looking at shift workers, looking at the cost of and the value of free time. And so we're all, we all have full-time jobs. We are being paid. And that's not the case for everybody. That's not the case for somebody who works 2 shift jobs or a part-time job. And so capturing those people and then paying them for their time and really associating that value and that investment with it, I think is something that's going to come from this. And I've been very proud to see the progress that's made in that, because it was definitely missing 2 years ago. I think it is still missing now, but I think we're a lot closer to getting there.
Yeah. So 2 years ago this week, all of our active. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. All of our active operations paused. Just due to the pandemic, we're running a microtransit service. It's inherently shared. You're close to other people. So, but the need for transportation didn't stop, and I think that that's something that we all learned. A lot of us, like you said, we're staying home, working from home, but a large segment of the population was still working, and they were performing those essential tasks that we all have depended on over the last 2 years. So we were able to get a really ragtag group of engineers. They brought shuttles home and were working on them in their garage. We would have stand-ups where it's like, someone's in their garage with their laptop, like saying like, look what I worked on, and their lawnmowers in the background, whatever. But we were able to find another Michigan company to partner with to create a set of features that we could put in our vehicles to make riders and our operators feel a little more safer during the pandemic and allow us to get back on the roads, which was really interesting. Moving forward, I think that just understanding the crucial impact that transportation plays in a city and beyond, and the fact that that need never goes away. Also, as a autonomous vehicle transportation company, AVs are very interesting. People are really want to try them out. But during the pandemic, we saw more people using personal vehicles for transportation. And I love public transit, but we need to get more people sharing rides, driving less. And so I think we've learned that autonomous vehicles are a way to kind of evangelize people to using public transportation. And if we can make transportation systems that people want to use and encourage the use of other existing larger transit systems, that is something that we're definitely going to take moving forward.
Yeah, Paul, what about you? What did you learn in the last 2 years?
That we don't know what we don't know. The impact on cities and central business districts and smaller communities is going to be something that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to. We had a very strong program to create over 200 high-tech companies in downtown Ann Arbor, 3,500 employees. They were the market for the restaurants and the shops. When you have an event like this, we're all here, the restaurants and the shops benefit. On a normal day in most central business districts in America, still to today, they're largely empty. And the question that we all have to grapple with is this grand experiment of remote working and people living far away from where their actual job is. What does that mean for city development? And on the equity side, a lot of the folks that worked in those people-facing businesses were in the lower income, middle income category. And when those jobs aren't there anymore, how are we going to respond to that? So for us, we're in the middle of trying to do a strategic plan update right now and trying to grapple with all those issues. And we see a shift in what we do as an entity in that curation process of our platform of working with the academic sector, local government, and private sector about how do we position ourselves to create the best futures for the people that live in our community moving forward. So my main message to you is there's a whole lot of uncertainty out there. If anybody tells you that they know how it's going to turn out a year or 2 years from now, they're kidding you.
Thank you. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to give you guys an opportunity. These guys talked about so much great stuff. If anyone has any questions, I will open the floor up. Yeah. There's a lot of construction, so shout. you guys hear that?
Yeah, so great question. I also, want to see more public transportation funded, more bike shares, et cetera. But something that we found from operating autonomous vehicles, actually in Grand Rapids, Michigan, we surveyed our riders, and we actually found that over 20% of them had never taken any other public transportation systems. But after taking our shuttles, we're starting to use other existing public transit systems in their city. And here's the kicker. Our shuttles were following the exact same route as a city bus. The city bus had been there for a few years. They had the same stops. They were both free. But it took this new technology to help people discover existing public transportation systems, kind of understand how to read the routes, and kind of dip their toes into shared transportation and public transit. So I think that it's a great way to, catch people's eyes and introduce them to the world of public transit.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to her company again. So Cavenue is intentional in the sense that we need to figure out how to use the system now. I mentioned the hype before, that where we were going to be, the Jetsons were going to be flying around and flying taxis and all that. There's a need to solve problems now. And so, at least what I understand, and she can explain it further, is how do we use the existing technologies we have now to make the current legacy system work better while that new future is coming? But you got to demonstrate it somewhere, and what they're doing is they're going to say, we're going to do this in this geography between downtown Detroit and Ann Arbor. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about scaling. So how do we take what we have available to us today, so some of the ADAS enabled vehicles, whether that's parking assist, lane keeping, automatic braking, how do we take those technologies and make them better? And then so by making them better, we're enabling the road to help the cars bring in information and help that with the processing. And then how do we then take that one step farther, and as we work towards fully autonomous vehicles, use that momentum, use that technology that we've now future-proofed the roads with, and build towards that future. And then also going back to what Aaron said too, is getting people outside of their vehicles, even if it's just for a one-off ride, they start to see themselves being able to experience transit not in their own vehicle. And so if we can make it fun for a night out while they're going, or if it's during the day and they use it just to get around downtown to and from their office, great. Over time, it becomes easier for people to make that decision on a daily basis. And so if we can get everyone's mindset to move even just a small increment over time, we can change things better. Any other questions? Yeah.
Caitlin, I'm sorry, can I comment on that really quick? I think I'm putting my consultant hat on. Everything here is very private sector, very innovative, very sexy, very what's coming, and can address the behaviors that will get people on the buses, that will get people to use the existing systems, but it isn't necessarily addressing how they're going to be funded publicly, which is where all of our tax dollars go. And so I think while everything that has been said is a solution, and I think it's really that behavior, the other side of it is we are paying an infrastructure that was built 10, 15 years ago today. So how are we going to pay for both? And it's this impossible question, and nobody wants more taxes and X, Y, Z, that whole conversation. And I think when we think about these solutions, there's the behavior of it, there's the listening. We did a focus group with youth, and they don't plan on getting driver's licenses. And I think that's really important to understand if you're an automaker, if you are designing streets for personal vehicles. And so it's really that conversation that's a part of it, and then getting people comfortable and understanding. And there's a lot of stigma removal, and there's a ton around it. We have to take the depoliticized transit and just make sure that people understand that taking a bus is as effective, if not more, than taking an Uber. And I'm not there. I would be lying if I said I didn't own a car. But I think it's really important that that's the discussion with policymakers. The policymakers determine the funding. And so if we can get in front of them and say, this is important and this is why, and these are your constituents, and they might not be voting for you today because they're 16, but they might in 2 years, that's where it is, because those decisions and the investment for what the DOTs are doing isn't happening by the managers at the DOTs, it's happening by the legislators. And so I think it's really important to understand everything that they're doing is innovative and is really going to augment those systems so you can close those gaps on those last mile trips and you can make it a comprehensive system. So I think you guys are all doing awesome work. I've been lucky to work with all of their firms and it's awesome, but there is the not sexy, this bus is not funded and says it's not in service. So I think, yeah.
Yes. All right, last question.
A lot of commuters will follow incentives. Most companies will offer free parking, free transit. Do you expect companies to be as generous with autonomous shared rides as they are with previous funded commutes like parking and transit?
Yeah, perfect. Erin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, we actually had a pilot in Detroit that was only providing transportation for employees of a company to get from their parking structure to the office. And this company had a lot of parking structures throughout Detroit. We just took over one route, but we were able to replace, I think, 12, 24-passenger diesel buses with 4 or 5, low-speed electric vehicles. And the feedback that we got from riders was actually really unexpected. They loved it because you didn't have to wait for the 24-person diesel bus to fill up to make the trip. You could take 2 or 3 people in a shuttle and go to your office and get there faster. There were more frequent vehicles. So yeah, I think that's been demonstrated in maybe a handful of use cases. But it really takes the rider, to give that feedback of we like this because it's faster or because there's less waiting time. Really just going back to centering the rider in the development process.
We're in a seller's market for employees right now. So the things that employees think are important are now top of mind for employers who are in a global competition for talent. So my answer is, yeah, I think we're going to see that kind of subsidization of this kind of service as we move forward, because the employees are going to say, this is what we want.
And we'll probably see it even more than we did pre-pandemic, because you're right, the market is totally in turn of the talent, and the incentives to come and work for a company are just exponentially getting higher. It's more than just foosball tables and free lunch. It's pick me up at my house. How am I getting somewhere?
But the last thought on that, it's got to be a system that is really, really flexible, because for it to work, if your kid gets sick, if you can't get the service right away, you're going to default to your car every time. So it's got to have the ability that it is really, really seamless and can be used all the time. Or the employees will say, it doesn't work for me, where's my parking space?
Yeah, I always say that whatever we're designing in the future has to be shared, on demand, and climate friendly. And I think that there's just no way of, especially now, there's a hybrid work situations, there's working from home, and so I really need an incentive to get me where I need to be. And if that's available through my employer, then yes, that makes employers even more attractive.
And I think that problem is, this opportunity is only going to get more and more prevalent with younger generations who are very much in tune with climate change, and they don't want driver's license. And so we'll have to continue to increase these programs over time and make it really part of their full employment package. Whereas, maybe 20, 30 years ago, people are asking questions about retirement plans and pensions, but now they're asking about commuter programs and remote work policies. So there's definitely been an enormous shift in the last couple years on what companies can do to either attract or retain their talent.
I think I want to add something on incentivization and how we're defining it. And so if we talk about financial incentives, I think that, it's come up in the terms of diesel, and you said climate. We haven't talked about carbon emissions at all and how those affect different populations differently, and the consequences, what happens when we don't actually think about how transportation is the largest, component of carbon emissions. And so everything we're talking about, though it hasn't been stated, is a solution in that direction. And so if you have a workforce that's thinking about things like their carbon footprint and they're trying to actually make some difference, I know for myself, I like working for a company that I know is going to make that a focus. And so I think that these are all solutions, and it's a part of that messaging and kind of telling the story of here are these different options. And I think it's about making it fun and making it feel rewarding for both ends, but then also making it easy to say yes to. And so I think when we think about the incentive, is it just it's a great job? Is it just a dollar amount, or is it about like your actual impact as a human, and your values and how you can connect the way that you're getting around to that? I think that it's really important to think about an expanded definition of incentives.
Perfect. Well, that is the perfect way to end it. If you have any other questions, the panelists and myself will be hanging around for a little bit longer, so feel free to grab us. But thank you for joining us today.